I'm a firm believer that if you take a look at what a child is interested in when he or she is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, that's a clue as to what that person should study. A lot of what we want to do in green infrastructure is found in the arcades of aqueducts. Every practice has what I call the weak link. A lot of the innovations we see, they have to be driven in the end by what we would consider to be the bottom line. I think it's incumbent upon us to bring what we do to the people, because people at their very evolutionary basis relate and want to be with water.
That is Bill Hunt, the William Neal Reynolds Distinguished University Professor and Extension Specialist at the Department of Agricultural and Biological Engineering at North Carolina State University in the USA. Since falling in love with hydrology back in 1993, Bill has been instrumental and passionate in advancing America's adoption of sustainable stormwater management and green infrastructure. He is considered by many to be the godfather of stormwater green infrastructure in the US and has helped hundreds of practitioners effectively implement and maintain practices across the globe. My name is Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways. We reflect on the many out-of-the-box ways our guests have navigated the complexity and intricacies of the environment at the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. On today's show, Bill and I look at his incredible career to date, from major achievements in stormwater green infrastructure to his interest in history and Roman engineering and our innate connection to water. We reflect on Bill's incredible journey along what he regards as the Camino of life, the key moments that have shaped him, the power of humility, and how you can find your passion and give back to humanity. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the show. Bill, it's great to have you on the show.
I'm really honored that you invited me, Peter. It means a lot. Thank you.
Now you've been requested heavily by previous guests and people that have spoken to me about the show. So I'm really glad that we were able to make this work.
Thank you.
Especially during hurricane season.
Oh yeah, it's funny, Peter, but we just had one blow through North Carolina, and it fortunately did not pack a ton of wind with it, but there was a fair amount of rain. We had about 13 centimeters of rain. And so yesterday, as the quote, good professor, unquote, a couple of my students went out and we went and checked all of our monitoring stations. And I was just loving it, running around outside. My students even took a picture of me skipping. I was skipping. I was so happy because it's a lot of rain. And, there's a lot of joy because we kind of wait for these moments and we put all of our monitoring assemblies in the field and you get to actually watch them working in sort of the heat of the moment, and the intensity part of the storm. We were soaked and it was great fun. I was loving it.
I can imagine. But normally it's the winds that would be blowing you away, right? Do your monitoring stations survive that?
Yeah, that's the fortunate thing, that in this particular case, it didn't pack a lot of winds to begin with, and then it also came to shore up an entire state away. So by the time it got to us, it wasn't nothing. I think they had 50 kilometer per hour wind gusts, which is not nothing, right?
It's not nothing.
It's not nothing. But when a hurricane comes, you're looking at 100 kilometers per hour, 120 kilometers per hour at the minimum, right? So at 50, you're like, well, it's not nothing, but we felt safe to be outside.
No, that's good.
It was great.
And reminds me of two moments. Once when I started my research career, I would always remember my colleagues doing monitoring. Every time there's an event, they'd be excited. If there's rain coming, they would go out and try and get some samples.
Yeah.
And now at the moment, I've got a little system out with a weather station trying to test efficacy of some filter materials. And I'm also feeling that now. Every time rain comes, it's like, oh, data.
It's just data. In fact, many years ago, I wrote a song, it was a rip rap, and one of the lines in it is, "We're always happy when it rains." And that line is actually shouted. It's the end of one of the stanzas.
Yeah.
So just understand that I'm on board. We're fired up when it rains. It's good times. And that's an advantage of being a stormwater guy, Peter, is because it's sunny, you're happy. It's raining, you're happy. I'm happy pretty much all the time.
That's true. I mean, you can go into, drought research while there's a drought, and then when the floods come, you just switch disciplines a bit. So, no,
it's
definitely
a great field to be in.
But you've hinted out a few things that also bring back memories to me from when we met many, many years ago. I think I was still doing my PhD when you visited Australia. And I think we were at a conference as well. But yeah, it's been a long time. Melbourne.
But Peter, when I met you, from the moment I met you, I'm like, that guy is going to do something big. He's going to be a big man in the field. And I think this podcast is proof that hunch is bearing out to be correct.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I'm glad you've taken some enjoyment from the podcast so far. Particularly, I know you've had a chance to listen to John Hathaway, episode 24. That was a really nice discussion I had with him. And also to Anna Delitic, episode, I keep butchering this, episode 9.
I was about to say 8, but you would know better than I.
No, in fact, I always butcher the number. I usually say it's 8, but I keep mixing it up.
You're good. Well, the fact that you got one of my students, Hathaway is one of my students, alumni, and one of the things is you kind of get closer to the end of your career, which admittedly I am. You take great joy in seeing the success of your pupils. In fact, their success many times means more to you than your own. And John certainly is one of those people that I'm just so proud of, and all the things that he's doing to help promote smarter development and stormwater, green infrastructure here and, of course, overseas. So it means a lot to me that you asked John to do it. I love that. That's just awesome.
Yeah. We enjoy chatting with each other. I think we engage quite closely in the stormwater network. I think that's quite evident in, I guess, a lot of the connections I have been able to make across the world in this discipline. But I guess, coming back to you, your journey also started in that similar ways, I guess, to myself, to John. In fact, we had this discussion of why did we go into engineering in the first place?
Right.
And the recurring theme I notice that happens all the time is that it's either between engineering because you're good at maths or it's something else.
Yeah, that's a true statement.
And in your case, what I thought was interesting was it was civil engineering and also followed closely by economics.
Right. And actually, if you go back a step, when I was in high school, it actually was between engineering and history. I really liked history. But my dad, who certainly one of the greatest influences in my life, said, Bill, it is easier to make a living in engineering and keep history as a hobby, which is what I did. So I chose to go to the engineering school, which happens to be actually where I work now, which is pretty neat, NC State. And then while I was intending to minor in French.
Oh.
And engineering is dominated by dudes, guys, right? It's less so now than it was when I went to school 3.5 decades ago. And I remember my very first math class, there was 40 people in it and one girl. I'm like, oh, this is what they said about engineering. So the next class I had after that was French. And I placed in the 4th semester French. I thought, I'll only get a minor in French. And it was great because there was like 32, 33 people in the class and 2/3 of them were girls. I'm like, thank God for French. But what's funny is I wasn't very good at it. I did okay. I did fine in my first class, but second class, it was like I was on the Titanic. It was a sinking ship.
Oh, geez.
And I had to switch out because I wasn't going to pass. Or if I did, I would have sacrificed a lot of other grades. And so I switched into economics, and that has had a big impact on my life. I say more maybe my career. It has a big impact on my career because I've always been fascinated now by studies or problems that definitely are merging engineering, civil engineering, water resources, now bio and ag engineering, soil and water with economics. Because honestly, I think a lot of the innovations we see, they have to be driven in the end by what we would consider to be the bottom line. Maybe the triple bottom line, but the bit of bottom line of are they willing to pay for it? And that really is hammered in your head when you study econ.
I mean, we talk about the triple bottom line nowadays in sustainability principles. It's been around for ages. You've got your economics, which I think is still somewhat dominating the decision space, but then you got the environmental and the people. And considering all three, balancing it out, at the end of the day, when you look at what methods are available, many of them are still economics. So I guess it's good to have some of these skills under your belt so that you can use them whenever you need to.
That's right. Yeah. And I also would say that I'm a very firm believer in economic principles. And the reason that the environment doesn't always fare well in terms of economics-based decisions is that we have not done as good a job as we need to in assessing the economic benefit of environmental protection or basing decisions on certain environmental standards. There really is And that's this whole idea of externalities that, something can happen in the environment that the producer doesn't have to pay for. And I think to me, that's a big part of, I think once we do a better job of capturing and basically eliminating what's referred to as externalities, you'll be able to make even more decisions solely based on economics and arrive at environmentally friendly decisions.
No, I certainly think so.
But you know what? That's for other people to worry about now. I'm getting too old.
But I think we've made a lot of progress in that, in starting to understand that there is a hidden benefit that we can't quite yet put a dollar value on, but I think we learn how to quantify it in different ways. And as far as I can see, for example, avoided costs, avoided costs of hospitalizations, if there's excessive heat in cities, or loss of life if there are floods or damaged buildings, those kinds of costs, they factor in eventually. And if you don't have to pay them because your stormwater management scheme worked well, or your flood control measures were in place, then oftentimes it sort of balances out.
I agree completely. And sort of almost a positive way, another example, maybe a positive illustration of that is the idea of making your stormwater control measures look good, right? And be aesthetically pleasing. And what developers have learned, because it used to be, let's take that sucker out back, right? But what developers have learned is that if you make it look good, you can charge more, people are willing to pay more. And by investing a little bit extra money in your stormwater measure can increase your total revenue, which leads to more profit. And so we are seeing that done more and more where stormwater practices are being amenitized. And I actually think that is one of the major focus points. I know as an instructor, as a teacher of stormwater designers, I try to lean on them on that, because if you can create amenities, people don't want to lose amenities. And they're willing to pay for them. And if you can turn your infrastructure into an amenity, then, we're going to be in business for a long time designing those, right?
No, definitely.
And they'll be taken care of, which is a key as well.
It builds the stewardship in the people.
That's exactly right.
And in many conversations that we've had in the past on this show, that somehow is what we're all striving for nowadays. So it's nice to see that everyone's sort of aligned in the strategy that they're trying to take to implement this and, create better stormwater management and greener cities as a result. But, without getting too far ahead, I guess it goes without saying, you're in that space. You'll call it one of the, the godfathers of green infrastructure, stormwater, green infrastructure, especially in the US. But what inspired you to get into this field in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question, Peter. I'm going to go back to when I was a kid, all right? And I'm a firm believer that if you take a look at what a child is interested in when he or she is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old or whatever, that's a clue as to what that person should study or put their career towards. And I loved water. I've always loved water. To give you some idea, my parents had a channel. It was really a ditch in front of the house that was, the water would flow when it rained, and that was it. So when it would rain, I would go outside and I would build dams in that ditch. And I could sit there and be mesmerized by watching the water rise up against my dam and breach my dam. And then I'd start building new. I mean, I think about that. I was 8. I loved that stuff, right? And I think, that's in my heart. Now, why did I go study what I studied? Well, I told you about my father who said, history or engineering, maybe you should study engineering because it's easier to make a living in that. But my father worked in the air pollution realm.
Okay.
And while I wasn't as much of an air pollution guy, I was always fascinated, obviously, by environmental protection. Loved being outside. I spent a lot of time going to the beach, playing outside, out back. That's, what we used to do is your parents let you go outside, you'd run out in the woods. And that was a great way to live, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I was interested in water flow and in protection. And that's how I found myself getting into civil engineering. But I liked other things about engineering too. I was fascinated by roadway design, certainly soils. I could tell you all the tallest buildings in every city in North Carolina. I mean, people here would say, Hunt, you are a nerd. I was, probably still am. So I was fascinated, but I had an instructor and his name was Dr. Rooney Malcolm. And he was the godfather of stormwater in our state. And he inspired me. He did. I had a homework question where we're doing flood routing. And I was into it, Peter. I was into it. And it was Friday. And the homework wasn't due till the following Tuesday. But I was in there. I was working on my spreadsheets just before we did all the modeling. I was working on my spreadsheets, putting my flood routing spreadsheet model together. And this is way before that people didn't have cell phones, because there was a phone in the lab, in the computer lab. And I had a date that night. And I went over to the lab phone and I called my date. And I said, hey, I'm running an hour late. Can I see you in an hour? And she's like, what? What? I said, I'm just trying to get something done. Needless to say, when I got there for the date, it didn't go very well, because she was pretty upset that I delayed our date to spend an extra hour on a hydrology spreadsheet. But that gives you some idea, Peter, how much I love this stuff, right? And so I got really lucky. And my master's degree actually didn't align as much with stormwater. It was wetlands related, and that was very important. And I worked under a very distinguished professor, Dr. Wayne Skaggs, member of the National Academy of Engineering, in the biological and agricultural engineering department. So I switched fields a little bit that way. But that was also an important part. And actually, because I got the degree here, I got exposed to certain jobs that were available in my department. And that's how I got hired, because they knew I loved stormwater, but there was a job in my department that the faculty here got to know me because I was getting my master's here. And so I just had felt very blessed about that. It was I basically came along at the perfect time to do what I do.
So in a way, you gathered that quantity knowledge, going through your bachelor's, your civil engineering degree, fell in love with hydrology, and then in your master's got exposed to more the biological side, the agricultural side.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And that has also helped. You take those two things and you add in this sprinkling of economics, that's kind of defined more or less what my career research interests have been. They've basically related to some of those three things. Always hydrology.
A bit like a perfect combo.
Yeah, it's been a neat combo. It's been great. It's been a lot of fun.
No, definitely. And I like the point you made about going back to your childhood when you're 5, 6, 7, or even 8 years old. I can remember I used to play a lot with Lego, building little cities and everything. I think at some point I did create some Lego models and tried to flood them. So, I think that's where the water element came in. I always spent the holidays on beaches. So, I guess more water exposure. I think it was just natural then after that I would get into the environmental aspects. Played a lot of SimCity on the computer. So I guess sprinkle in a bit of urban planning there and look where I am now. So it's a very neat reflection. And I think everyone should definitely do this and see how far they've come from their childhood days.
Well, I appreciate that, Peter, and hearing your story. And, I teach, I guess, obviously, hopefully people have realized that now, but and I used to teach a lot of freshman engineers, and they would often come to me, and that was the advice I gave them. What did you like when you were 8? And because they didn't know what major they should pick, because there's a lot of really good ones. Mechanical engineering is good. Aerospace is good. Chemical. I mean, they're all good. Civil is good. They're all good. And so I just think that's and I tell my children that now too. I've got 5 of them, Peter. And so
wow.
I'm like, I want you to think about what you really liked. And some of them right now, they're still in the heart of it. They're 8 or they're 10. And, I've been observing as a father, as a parent, you observe them too. And it's been pretty neat watching them grow and grow into potentially the fields that I would have guessed, honestly, 6, 7 years ago that they would have gone into.
Interesting.
And so it's been pretty neat for me just to even witness that. They're kind of like my little test cases.
I was going to say a little bit of validation, at least you have a good N number.
That's right.
No, it's certainly a very nice little reflection exercise that we can all definitely do. So I'm curious to see if listeners will engage and give me some feedback on what they think has come out of their own reflections. Nevertheless, coming back to your journey itself. So you were at NC State University for your undergraduate, your master's, and then you did a little stint at Pennsylvania State University for your PhD.
That's right.
Again, in the agriculture and biological areas, and then going back to NC State as the assistant professor, and then following your journey from there. One curiosity that I couldn't help but ask you now is, having gone through your education and your journey route, there's one term that I don't understand, actually. What is an extension specialist? I see that everywhere in every single title. So, you went from, assistant professor to, full professor to the long title of a professor, distinguished professorship that you have now. But every time there's this little add-on, which is and extension specialist. Could you tell me, what is an extension specialist?
Yeah. All right. I'm going to have to go back a little bit and to explain. All right. Yeah. So every state has something that's referred to as a land grant school, all right? And land grants come from the time of probably America's greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, certainly one of our, you could argue is the best one. Okay. And so actually during the time when some of the states were in rebellion, and this was land that was reserved and then given to every state. And remember that North America in the 1800s was still a time where lands were being conquered, right? United States fought against Great Britain to become independent, and the United States and Canada fought each other. And then Spain was involved in wars with France, So the United States went to war with Mexico and in the 1840s and got land in the southwestern part of what is now the United States. And this land was set aside and eventually given to the states. Peter, like, okay, so now why? But what are you telling me this for? Well, it was determined in the 1860s that education was only going to the elite of society, and that for the United States to grow as a nation, we needed to educate people in the realms of engineering and agriculture, because basically you could say the realms of industry. And so a whole slew of universities, every state has one. In fact, the first one of those was Penn State University, where I got my PhD. They opened in 1855. All right. They actually predated Abraham Lincoln. But the rest of the states got their money. They got this land. They sold this land. And they used the money from the sale of that land to set up these land grant schools. All right. So the mission of the land grant school was not only to teach engineering and agriculture, but it eventually morphed into making sure that students and professionals were educated, that there were continuing advances. Think about agriculture, all the advances that have happened, that there were continuing advances in agriculture and in industry that alumni or graduates or just professionals needed to be made aware of. And so in 1914, officially something called the Smith-Lear Act happened, and that established extension. And all extension is the outreach of those land grant schools into the community. All right. And so when you see extension specialist on the backside of my name, and this is true, that the principal part of my job is not to conduct applied research. It's not to teach students on campus. That the principal part of my job is to extend the knowledge on campus and from other campuses, of course, across the globe, and bring them to, in my case, to a design community. And so I bring mine to the stormwater design community. So every year, I'll teach 20 workshops. And by workshop, I don't mean a 1-hour seminar. I mean, people get together, we'll spend a couple of days, and we'll focus on things like maintenance of stormwater control measures or new practices that are emerging, something like bioswales or regenerative stormwater conveyance, or we'll go back to the fundamentals of how to design stormwater control measures. And so I do a lot of that teaching, and that's actually the principal component of my job. So that's why you see an extension specialist, but it is a unique thing to land grant schools in the United States.
Very, very interesting. And so that's in a way also the best way to get out there and to bring that knowledge to the people who will then be implementing these systems, maintaining these systems. And from what I see, you've done like over 400 workshops in just North Carolina state alone around the design of these kinds of systems.
Right. I've been at it for a while.
Yeah.
But I will say that it is a two-way street. It absolutely is a two-way street. That while we're delivering this information, I've had multiple conversations with professionals that have led to research projects that I don't think I would have dreamed up on my own. Okay. For example, 2.5 decades ago, we were putting a lot of emphasis into constructed stormwater wetlands, okay? And they provide a lot of ecosystem services. That was not a term I used back then, but we know now they provide a lot of ecosystem services. They can really be nice amenities, blah, blah, blah. But as they were going in, there were a lot of people that would ask the following question. Hey, Dr. Hunt, are you building mosquito breeding grounds? Are these mosquito magnets? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know. And being that we're at the Engineering and Agricultural University, we had a mosquito specialist.
Convenient.
That I approached, Dr. Charles Apperson, and I talked to him about it, and we set up a study, and we looked at 52 ponds and wetlands from all over the footprint of North Carolina, and they employed the proper entomological study, all right, to determine if they were mosquito breeding grounds or not. We found out that 12 out of the 52 were, 40 of them weren't, and from the 12 that were, we statistically determined what certain causes could be and what potential remedies would be. And so now the constructed stormwater wetlands of North Carolina are all designed based on mosquito limitation or limiting mosquito populations as much as they are for water quality improvement and hydrology. But that study would not have happened if I had not been doing these workshops talking about constructed wetlands and having that feedback. Right. And so one of the things I want to hammer home or make an important point is it's important for us in academia to carry with us humility. I was looking at some of and for the audience, Peter does an amazingly good job of prepping the speaker. I've been on podcasts before, and there's how Peter does it, and then there's a drop to where everybody else is. Okay. I was looking through some of the questions that you had posed, and I think that's one of the key lessons that I would love to share with people that I have learned is that when we act with humility and don't pretend to know everything, we open ourselves to learn even more. And that, to me, is one of the main things I think I've learned in my career. In fact, Peter, I would say that there's been times in my career where I've been less humble, more arrogant, whatever you want to say. And those times, while at the moment they were productive, they led to lapses in things, all right? It may have been productivity. It may have been harmed relationships. Personal, right? And I think it's important that, we're here talking about stormwater and green infrastructure and sustainability, but there's also sustainable relationships you have to have, right? And so I think one of the things I've really learned in my 27 plus years of working in the field is that the times where we allow humility to help counter the drive, the inner drive that we have, tend to be some of the best times that I've had in my career.
They're certainly the most educative times. I mean, I've certainly experienced that talking to practitioners in Australia back in 2017. In fact, that was one of the things that inspired me to do this podcast. But that was when talking to a lot of these practitioners around the country about stormwater management, green infrastructure, water-sensitive urban design, just listening to their stories and giving them a chance to really express themselves really teaches you a lot. And if you didn't have that humility aspect, you wouldn't be, realizing how much you didn't know about what actually happens in the field. This particular mosquito example is, front and center of everyone's concern here in Switzerland as well, now that they're just getting into the whole practice, calling it sponge cities, by the way.
I like that name. Yeah. I know it's from China, and it's a very clever name.
Very, very clever. Definitely something people can latch onto. But this whole idea of mosquitoes and, worries around that. And as you mentioned, sometimes as an academic, you might just dismiss it and you might think, wetland, well, it's going to attract things that will eat the mosquitoes. But when you dig deeper into it, actually, there are certain things you can learn. And just with that example that you've described, designing them to be, I guess, mosquito repellent or at least accommodating, but not to an extreme extent.
That's right. I call them mosquito limited designs.
Limited, yes.
There's no such thing as a mosquito free. But I don't know if there's any stormwater practice that holds water in it for more than 7 days that's mosquito free.
I think it's very difficult.
Yeah, but there are designs that you can have that limit the population of mosquitoes. And obviously that's one of the things that we have to think about going back to ecosystem services. That's where biodiversity comes in. That's a really important ecosystem service. It not only can help make your practice look better and be more appealing to the majority of people, but it can also keep it to be less of a nuisance and, let's face it, safer. Because if someone gets sick because they've been bitten by a mosquito, I hate to say it, some of that's on us in the stormwater community, right?
No, definitely. And I think it goes both ways. Practice and research has to learn from each other.
Right.
And this is one classical example of that.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be within the same, discipline itself. It can be across disciplines. Like I know there's a big debate, and maybe you can reflect upon this here in Switzerland, about putting in stormwater measures that infiltrate the water around groundwater protection areas. And everyone's very concerned about it because of the potential pollution. We do have areas where we have to maintain that groundwater quality because the water supply is dependent on it. So you're starting to overlap in different jurisdictions and different kinds of responsibilities and domains.
Well, we've dealt with that at some point, especially early on with permeable pavement, because obviously that's a practice that if it's going to work to its fullest extent, it's going to put water into the ground. And actually, we ended up appealing to some research that was done in Lyon by our friends in France. And they had showed, I said, well, you have to make sure, they showed basically you have to have some separation from the bottom of your infiltrating practice to where your water table was going to be. But the good news is that if you do have that separation, it certainly did appear. At the time, for the constituents tested, the water was sufficiently clean to enter in. Now, one of the things I think we do have to worry about is that there's so many pollutants out there, the legacy forever chemicals, right? And I have gotten some concern now on that because we just don't know all of them that are out there. And there's been a big issue in Eastern North Carolina with PFAS. And that's been a concern because it gets people's drinking water and of course it can cause people to get sick. And it wasn't something that we've really ever worried about in stormwater, but the reality is it's there. And so now thinking about an infiltration system that is putting water that might have some PFAS in it, well, then that is a concern. And I think we do have to do some more research on that. So I guess I can see the situation dealing with in Switzerland. I can argue both sides that what we have studied so far, I think you can design to have infiltrating systems and be fine. But the concern is are these forever chemicals that we're not removing. And that's going to be something, again, that I see sort of that next generation of stormwater researcher sinking their teeth into.
Now, I can imagine if I look back on the practice itself, we always started with quantity in many cases, trying to deal with the stormwater. If we think historically, urbanization has caused serious issues with urban hydrology, and we've had to sort of decouple, the effects of imperviousness in urban areas to prevent flash floods or, other degradation of the environment. And then we moved from there to thinking about nutrients. I think you've also got some stories around nutrients and pollution and receiving waters. From there on to bathing water quality. So we start looking at some bacterial removal, then to the heavy metals as well. And it feels like not only is our to-do list growing, but the diversity of things we have to deal with for each item in the to-do list is also becoming more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also means that we need more and more different types of professions to be consulted in the field. When it was just hydrology, Peter, it was really the domain of the civil engineer and the odd agricultural engineer, okay? And now the domain is not held by one discipline or two or even 10 to do a really good job. And it's not like every single project you need to have 10 different types of professionals involved. Sometimes you don't, but certainly the big ones. And I find that personally very exciting. I think some people that I just like the way it was. Well, stormwater is a really crappy field for you then. But for people who are excited about how dynamic the field is, I love it. And I certainly would qualify as that. I love it. I love what's happening and that more people get to be involved.
And I guess where do you say the US is at now? What's sort of the focal area around stormwater management?
Yeah, it depends on the state. It's called the United States of America. And that state thing actually really does matter. And every state will have different concerns. In North Carolina, and I say that across the board, people are going to look at sediment removal, no matter what state you're in. But North Carolina, we're pretty heavily invested into nutrient management. That was due to historic fish kills that we had in the 1990s, which, by the way, is why I got my job.
Okay.
So we had these big fish kills, and they were triggered by algal blooms, and the algae was, pinned back to the fact that we had too much nitrogen and phosphorus in our waters, ag and urban, and wastewater for that matter. So we have parts of our state that really are focused in on nitrogen and phosphorus, and our design standards lean on that. If you go to the coastal counties of our state, then there's swimming waters, as you mentioned that at the beginning. And as you also just said, that bacteria and other indicator species typically is what we're testing for, but bacteria and other pathogens can get people sick. And so we worry about that in the coastal part of North Carolina. And in the mountains, we have trout fishing. And I think the word for trout in German is forella. I studied German many years ago, but I think a trout is a forella. Yeah, I'm just doing that because you might have more German speakers,
yes,
and I just want to make it real for them.
We do have a pretty big audience from Germany, actually, I must say.
Fantastische. I don't do a lot of German guys, but ich möchte zwei Großbier bitte. I know some of the big things. Dunkel bitte. Okay. So trout like cold water. And so in the mountains of North Carolina, we actually have temperature. We worry about thermal pollution. Now, I would say it's sort of rudimentary, but they will promote practices that we know cool the water before it's released, versus open air systems like ponds that, heat up in the afternoon sun.
Yeah.
And so it really does depend. And that's just North Carolina, right? California has major trash TMDLs because they're worried about that getting into the different bays. And many states will worry or have specific watersheds where they'll have copper or lead, not so much anymore, but copper, TMDS will worry about certain metals. And then, as I said before, microplastics, right? There's a lot of interest in microplastics. The research has not led to design standards yet, but I would expect in the next 4, 5, 6 years, you'll start seeing design standards that are for stormwater practices that will factor in microplastics. I don't think we're that far away from that. And then, as I mentioned before, these forever chemicals. I don't know how that research is so nascent right now, but at some point. And the other thing, Peter, is that flooding, of course, is ubiquitous. We worry about that. And in certain parts of the country, particularly states and cities where we don't have combined sewer systems, much of America is so new that the sanitary system was separated from the stormwater system. In fact, in my state, North Carolina, there isn't a single combined sewer in our whole state. Georgia, I think Atlanta, I think there's 2 of them. Atlanta happens to be one of them. But in the Northeast, what we would refer to as the Rust Belt states, where cars are made, historically, Michigan, Ohio, there's a lot of combined sewer systems there. But in the separate sewer systems, we see a lot of open ditch or open channel flow.
Okay.
And open channel flow, we deal with erosion and on property loss. And that has been a real motivation as well for certain types of practices. That's really the concept of low impact development in great part address, which is the idea of returning hydrology to the natural condition. That really helped address stream bank erosion. So no matter where you are in the United States, even in North Carolina, there's going to be some set of different criteria that designers are trying to achieve.
But it's nice to see that there's no one blanket policy across the country, and especially in a country with 50 states where you have to work out the uniqueness of every single one of them, even going down to the county level. It's quite a complex task, but it's nice to see that the experience has been in a way gathered and things are done on a context basis and a place-based kind of approach, which is very essential.
It's the one size fits all is not true, right?
No.
And that's important. That's important. So that's why the states have, EPA, of course, is responsible for all of it, but the states are given a lot of autonomy. And I think it's similar is true in Germany, in the Federal Republic of Germany.
I think they also have that. Australia certainly has different approaches based on states, but they aren't anywhere near as many states.
Yeah, the 50 is a pretty big number.
Yeah, it's a pretty big number. And in Switzerland, we're trying to define ways of dealing with the water and based on cantonal regions and different districts. So, no, certainly very interesting. And I think it just shows the richness of knowledge that has been gathered, in the research in the US and through the practice as well. And I guess you focus in particular, on the wetlands, on the porous pavements, but also on what, if I refer to John's episode, he calls the Swiss Army knife of stormwater green infrastructure, which is bioretention systems as well.
We've done a lot with bioretention, and then the derivatives of bioretention, which would be bioswales, which is basically taking a swale and carving out a part of it to have bioretention media. And then something called regenerative stormwater conveyance. It's a pretty fancy name. Biofiltration channel is another name, where you'll take gullies and fill them with bioretention-like media and have the water flow through this media. So it's sort of like bioretention. It's a little bit like bioretention cells stacked up on each other, bioretention cells in series. And then there's a practice called a submerged gravel wetland, which is really a lot like bioretention, but it stays wet much closer to the surface than a bioretention cell would. So it's not just, and John is spot on, it is the Swiss Army knife of stormwater, but it's also spawned other little Swiss Army knives. I have a big Swiss Army knife. Well, when my boys were little, I bought them small ones, right? And so it's that idea that there's a lot, and that's happened because bioretention has been such a reliable practice if it is built right. If it's built right and obviously maintained, but there's so much it can do. Yeah. I mean, my PhD while at Penn State was on bioretention. So bioretention is very near and dear to my heart.
Definitely. And we've covered it several times on the show in the past, but it's nice to hear all the different variants and all the different cousins and near cousins of the same kind of approach, which is you have a filter media, how you combine it, how you put it together. That's, I guess we have many different guides for that. What kinds of plants do you plant into the system as well? That's going to depend on what you're using it for, what you're trying to target, and then what shape or form, elongate it as a little tree pit or a larger basin. I mean, I guess that is what makes the Swiss Army knife nature of it.
Absolutely. And you can have them be mostly underground even, right? Usually proprietary systems with some trees emerging, but therefore you can put them partly under streets or certainly under sidewalks. Yeah, bioretention's a great practice.
No, definitely.
And it's very common. We have, I want to say 65 of them on my campus alone.
Oh, wow.
On NC State University campus, there's 65 bioretention cells.
Do you monitor all of them?
Yeah, no. We've picked out a few of them. We did a study 5-6 years. It was right before COVID. It got published after COVID.
Okay.
On 15 of them. And actually it was an interesting study because we looked at, and this relates back to some of the earlier things we discussed. We said, look, the idea would be, hey, if a practice is more visible, it's more likely to be maintained. Mm-hmm. And if it's more likely to be maintained, then I'll expect that it will work better.
True.
And so we looked at 15 bioretention cells and 15 ponds and wetlands that were on the NC State campus. And we worked with the university, which is great. We looked at basically visibility tiers. They had a top-end visibility tier and a second-level visibility tier. And we thought we would see a difference in performance, but the reality is that NC State pretty good at maintaining their stormwater control measures no matter where they were. They might have only visited one once a year to do maintenance, but the high visibility ones were getting visited 4 times a year. Uh-huh. But for the ones we looked at, that one time a year, not just look at and walk away, but look at it, make changes, and go, that proved to be a sufficiently frequent maintenance regimen for it to at least function well. They didn't all look as good, but in terms of holding water for the appropriate lengths of time and subjecting the water to the treatment that we expected it to have, they actually almost all of them did really well.
So I guess what it would be required to get the people to notice these systems and cherish them, what would be the most important maintenance aspect?
Sure. Well, every practice has what I call the weak link, right? Yeah. A pond and a constructed wetland is the outlet structure and that orifice, which it can often be quite small for some of our smaller systems, and its propensity to get clogged, especially in wetlands, but it's true for both practices. And then all of a sudden your practice doesn't drain very well and plants drown and it looks ugly. And you can fix it, but it's an expensive redo too. So that would be a big one for wetlands. Bioretention, obviously, well, not obvious, but biggest issue we see with bioretention is if the media either gets clogged or it's installed wrong. One of the big issues we had, it's not as important now because the construction community, the contracting community has gotten a lot more savvy, but we had legit issues of the wrong media being put in that had too high a content of clays, and those were DOA, dead on arrivals.
Oh, wow.
And then the other issue we'd have is the practice would get in, but the watershed or the catchment wouldn't be stable, and then we'd have sediment coming in and clogging the surface of them. And that was repairable, but often could be an expensive repair. And when you had a couple of those, people got pretty upset about using them because compared to a pond, building a pond, they weren't subject to these, like what they considered to be nuances. Well, I didn't have to worry about the media, right?
True.
But the reality is once it's built right, it tends, because of the vegetation, bioretention does tend to be pretty self-healing. But still, a concern would be is an influx of fine-grained particles that would cause the media. Permeable pavement, that's the killer as well. It could be sediment. It could be leaf detritus that falls on it and gets ground in by tires. So, every practice has a weak link. And that's one of the things, we teach an inspection and maintenance certification. In fact, we've been doing this since 2006. When people ask me, Bill, what are your, quote, big accomplishments, end quote? I would say in terms of, as an extension specialist, which I went into that long monologue a little bit ago, as an extension specialist, probably starting the stormwater practice inspection and maintenance certification in 2006 would probably be my most important addition to the field. It's now been emulated in a lot of other states, but in 2006, no one else was doing it.
And this was done in conjunction with your good colleague and friend, also an extension, Bill Lord.
Right.
It's pretty awesome.
And by the way, the reason that happened was because of the other workshops I was talking about, and people kept asking me about maintenance. And remember, the humility and listening to them, like, that's a really good point. I need to think about that. And so that's why we developed this class. And we have, 5,500, 6,000 people have taken that class in North Carolina alone and passed the test.
Wow.
We've had people take the class and not pass the test because you are certified by the university. So there's a test that you have to pass.
That makes sense.
Well, most people pass it.
Okay.
But that's been a really important part. And I honestly believe that in our state, North Carolina, that the practices, and it does vary by jurisdiction. Some cities are going to be more restrictive and others will be more lenient respect to the types of maintenance that goes on. But I feel like by and large, practices in North Carolina work pretty well. It is jurisdiction dependent, but the way or the reason we can get these practices to work is that we train people.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, Peter, it's an important job for a university to do because we're trained instructors. We are trained teachers. And we're not teaching 20-year-olds, 18-year-olds. We are teaching professionals, but we know how to teach, right?
That's important.
And I think it's a really important thing for the university systems to be involved with. And I feel really lucky that we've been doing that now for almost 20 years.
And through the teaching, you empower these people who are going to construct these systems. When they understand what they're actually building, they can communicate it to the residents of the neighborhood that they're building it in. And the residents themselves gain some understanding and I guess appreciate the systems and don't end up accidentally mowing the plants from the bioretention.
Right.
A little anecdote I have heard.
No, that's a really good point. We don't live in a utopia here because that still happens.
Yeah.
But you do limit the chances. You can limit the chances by having an educated maintenance workforce that knows that this bioretention cell, don't fill it up with dirt. It's intended to be a bowl. In fact, Peter, in my PhD, I talked about a little bit earlier, is on bioretention.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, listeners, earlier, it's a depression, overlying media and under drainage with vegetation. Well, I drew up the plans. I'm an engineer, so I got to draw these plans up. I gave them to the contractor. I went out to the site. They were building this big parking lot, or what Europeans will call car parks.
Yeah.
Went out to the big parking lot, and I met with the contractor, and he goes, and I was a lot younger. I was in my 20s. He goes, son, he said, I've noticed something that's not quite right on these plans. I said, yes, sir. What is it? He says, see these parking medians, these medians here? All right. He said, right now they're bowls, and that's not how it's supposed to be. So tell you what, I will just put a nice little crown on them at no extra charge.
Oh, no.
I'll just take care of that for you, no extra charge. And I said, sir, I know this sounds crazy. This was in 2000. All right, so it's been a while. All right.
Yep.
I said, sir, this may sound crazy, but those islands are supposed to be bowls. They're supposed to be concave, and the water's supposed to get in them. And he looked at me like I had just grown a second head. And he looked at me and I was like, is that all right? If that's what you say, I said, yeah, that's how this has to be. That's how these work different. These are new. And I know he did not trust that. But you know what's interesting, Peter? I was actually over to see those practices about, it's been within the year. So, I mean, they're 20 some odd years old now. Still working.
Awesome.
Still working. They don't look the same. They're heavily vegetated, okay? But they're still working. Water's still perking in. The plants are still thriving. It's awesome. And that's the beauty of bioretention in that story, right?
And if it's done right, you have it for a long time.
If it's done right, it's resilient.
Yep.
You can have it for a long time.
And nature can recover depending on what comes through it, whether it's a hurricane or whether it's something else. So
that's exactly right.
Yeah. But I guess in a way, you've done stormwater green infrastructure for decades, and you've also just recently published a new book around the topic together with two other pretty big names in the US. Did you want to tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So we have a book, and anybody can get that book, but it is on green infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, and the title is Green Stormwater Infrastructure, Fundamentals and Design. And I had the privilege of working with two of my colleagues that I got to collaborate with heavily for greater part of a decade, Dr. Alan Davis, University of Maryland, and Dr. Rob Traver at Villanova University. And, a lot of the younger folks that might be listening, I guarantee you've cited papers from those dudes' groups, okay? Alan Davis was the original, I consider him sort of the original researcher of bioretention. And his first paper came out, I think, in 2001. And so I got to work with those two gentlemen, and it was actually a great collaboration because of my extension specialist job. I had done a lot with design standards. And if you go through the book, the chapters that tend to deal with design, well, those are the ones that my fingerprints are on pretty heavily. And if you look at the ones that are more on the fundamentals, well, a lot of those were written by Dr. Davis or Dr. Traver. It's not that we didn't assist the other chapters. They're everywhere. All of us wrote a little bit of everything. But that was the beauty, I think, of being able to work with those gentlemen, is that we each had different strengths that were brought to this book. And it's, it's kind of like, that was a big moment in my career, Peter, right? This was published 2 years ago. So I've been working for 25 years, and here was the textbook. And it was really driven. Dr. Davis deserves so much credit. Yeah, he deserves the credit to get this done. Dr. Traver and I were very lucky and happy to be working with him on this. But when this book got done, there was a sense of, now what? Yeah. Because you build to this, right? Peter, there really is 2.5 decades of work from my part in this book. And if you look at both Alan and Rob, you're probably looking at 75, 80 years of combined experience associated with the three of us writing this book, right? And so it was a very interesting thing when it was done, that it was almost like, okay,
we solved the world's problems.
Well, no, it's not that. It's that was an important waypoint in a career. And now you're looking like, what do I want to do now? Do I go back? Do we, not that we had left it, by the way, that's an important point to make, but do we dive headfirst back into doing stormwater, or do I dip my toe in a different pool, right? And that has been something that I did dip my toe in a different pool. It doesn't quite line up quite as neatly as what I'm sharing, but that's how I got into the Roman infrastructure and teaching courses in that and gaining inspiration from them. And also, as you might recollect at the very beginning, I talked about how my father was going to study either history or civil engineering. Yep. And my dad said, Bill, study civil engineering and keep history as a hobby.
And it had to come back in some form.
It did. It came back in as through Roman engineering. And interestingly, my great uncle was the National Latin Scholar of the Year in America back in the 60s. Well before, maybe the late 50s, but I think it was the 60s, well before I was born. And so this fascination with things Roman has apparently been in my family for, I don't know, at least 70 years, perhaps more, right? So that's been a really neat add-on. It's really a supplement. I know what pays the bills. I know my bread and butter is green stormwater infrastructure. It's stormwater. But to be able to add this other piece has been a very enriching part of my career.
I think definitely at some point you want to do something else just to see, to change things up a little bit. Yeah. I guess there's always that fascination, as you mentioned, with history in your case. You did say you're not so good at French, but how's your Latin? Any knowledge there?
Mon français est meilleur que mon Latin.
Okay.
And you probably, for those of your French speakers, are like, oh my God, what a butchering of our beautiful language. Je m'excuse. I apologize. My French is, but I can read French reasonably well. And so an obviously knowledge of French, you can make out Latin.
You can work out the Latin aspects eventually.
Yeah, you can work out Latin. Right. And I've had the pleasure of being in Spain, studying with another person you've interviewed, Dr. Luis Sanudo. And so, you can't also live in the southern part of the United States and not be exposed to Spanish. So the Latin is not insurmountable. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. But in a way, you've taught this course abroad, twice in Italy, from what I understand so far, and once in Spain.
Yes.
And it's about Roman infrastructure. So really about how the Romans did their water management.
That's right. My obvious bias in the class is the water side. Yep. And I would argue, and I think honestly, a lot of Roman scholars would agree that the most grandiose and maybe inspiring of the Roman infrastructural monuments that we have today are the arcades of the aqueducts. If you think about the Pont du Gard in France, the aqueduct of Segovia. Rome in Spain. Rome has an aqueduct park. outside, and they're just stunning. Even the ones that are in a more ruined state. There's a magnificent aqueduct in Mérida, Spain called Los Milagros, or the Miracle. And it's just, they're beautiful. And so a lot of what we want to do in green infrastructure is found in the arcades of aqueducts because they're aesthetically pleasing as well as being functional. And they also capture the people's attention and inspire people. Those aqueducts inspired people. Think about the aqueduct of Segovia in Spain. I've been to Segovia several times, and I actually made a little pilgrimage at one point of walking from the source. I took a bus and hiked up to the source of the aqueduct and then walked 17 kilometers. It may have been 13 kilometers, but it was kilometers back into town. I just traced the route of the aqueduct the best I could. It was a very moving experience. In fact, something else I would encourage any listener here, find a pilgrimage. Find a pilgrimage. And who knows what it is for you, right? But find a pilgrimage where you put sweat in it and you're by yourself. I personally think I've done the ones I've done, both religious and non. I've done them by myself, or spiritual, I should say. And non, I've done by myself. But it's an amazing experience. And so walking the route of the Segovian aqueduct, you're studying it, you're excited. They used that until the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
They had repaired it. It was maintained, which is a very important point.
It does look pretty intact, I must say, if you look at some pictures of it.
Oh, yeah. The aqueduct, the arcade that's most famous is very much intact. But the Spanish improved it. They kept it. They kept it working. They repaired it. But it had a run of about 1,800 plus years. And I would love for one of my constructed stormwater wetlands to work half that long.
That would be nice. I think it'll be fully overgrown, but
yeah, if it's still working, is it still treating water?
Yeah,
that's one of the lessons I like to share is that, as we design green stormwater infrastructure, there's something we can learn from the Romans about making it look good and be proud of it.
Yeah.
We should be proud as a profession. We should be proud. Not to the point about being arrogant and cocky. Remember talking about the whole humility thing?
Oh, yeah.
But we should be proud of the infrastructure we create because it does better people's lives. And think about how well we can sleep at night when you go to bed and put your head on your pillow. Like, the work I did today helped make people's lives better in whatever way we did. I wish that for every single one of your listeners. I do.
And that connection, people and water, has been really close to your heart in a lot of the approaches you've taken, the topics you've pursued. And I guess the message you also want to communicate. As engineers, we are designing things for people, for society to use. And it shouldn't necessarily just be hidden and top secret, but we should create that understanding and get people to, I guess, partake in it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that has been one of, you have formative moments in your life, tons of them really, right? One of mine was when my oldest son was 18 months. He was walking and we were in the Western North Carolina waterfalls. For anybody that listens, North Carolina has 2 world-class things to do in it. One of them is to go to where the Wright brothers' first flight was. That's in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So the very first heavier than air airplane was flown along the coast of North Carolina. And everybody that comes to our state should go see that. It's a very special, I find it spiritual, honestly, because it was like that was an impossibility, but that flight sort of killed the idea of the impossible. All right, that's one of the things. And the other side of the state, in the southwestern part of North Carolina, is one of the densest collections of waterfalls in the world.
Okay, wow.
And there's 200 waterfalls. There's even a bit more than that, but some of them are, there's some smaller ones that don't make the list. And that's one of my hobbies, by the way, is I love to hike waterfalls, hike 2 waterfalls and go in them and let the water crash upon my head. Of course I do, right?
Because why not?
Of course this guy would like that, but yeah, I love that. And I brought my oldest son, my wife at the time, and my oldest son were there. And you could see in him that he wanted to cross the creek at the base of the waterfall.
Okay.
And he might have been 19 months, but he wasn't that old. All right. Maybe 19 months. No, I'm sorry. I can say he was 22 months.
Yeah.
You're like, Bill, please stop moving it. It's a fine detail, but he's 22 months old, right? And so I held his hand, and that kid at 22 months old crossed that creek at the base. You could hear the thunder of the water hitting that pool coming down the waterfall. And I was so proud of him. And then what I did is I turned around and there's a bunch of people that were watching him cross that creek and they were really impressed. And then I looked at the people that were there, Peter, and there were older people and there were younger people. There are people whose first language was English, and there's people who didn't speak English. There were people that, in all probability, did not come from prosperous backgrounds, and those that certainly came from more affluent backgrounds. You know, every race you could imagine, every age, of course, both genders. And I realized at that moment that water is the great denominator for people. That all of us, no matter what our backgrounds were in awe of that waterfall, and we wanted to experience it. That was a very profound moment in my life. It was in 2008.
Wow.
And if you think about it, the first 9 months of an existence, and people will debate exactly when that starts, but sometime where you're in the womb, either the very beginning or at some point in the middle, you become a human. You're a human, and you're in water.
Yeah.
You're in water. So we spend 9 months before we're out breathing oxygen, we're in water. Humans have this evolutionary connection to water. And so now, what does that mean for us as water and hydraulic engineers, as green stormwater infrastructure engineers, right? I think it's incumbent upon us to bring what we do to the people, because people at their very evolutionary basis relate and want to be with water.
In some form or another.
In some form or another.
And it reminds me of a very nice quote from Jacques-Yves Cousteau. You know, we forget that, and I'm famous for butchering quotes on this show, so maybe I should probably get the quote. But we tend to forget that the water and life cycle are one. So
right,
yeah,
that's a great quote. That's a great quote. Yeah, I love that. I'm glad you brought Jacques Cousteau in here. You know, that's magnificent.
But in a way, it's true. I guess we need the water to help regulate the environment, regulate our own physiological environment. And if you can manage it, you know, in ways that help us, then, you know, you make the lives better.
And it's a calling. You know, one of the things that, and this again relates back to some of the early things like we talked about, like, what did you like when you're 6, 7, or 8? The idea is that something you liked when you were young like that can morph or evolve into a calling.
Yeah.
And the type of career, I want to have a job. And honestly, I want all of my students to have a job, and they may have to work their way into it. It's probably unreasonable to expect right out of the gate you get it, okay? Yeah. But I want all of them to have a job that becomes a passion, all right, involves a calling, because then the job doesn't seem like a labor. Or when you hit the points that are laborious, you have this grander thing that you're pushing for, right? And it helps you get through the tediousness without becoming discouraged. And I think that's a really important thing for people to continue to search for and develop in their career and in their life. You know, find what that calling is. And for people that love water, well, boom, then your passion is sort of identified right there.
Yeah.
And Peter, I really do enjoy my job almost every day I come to work.
Because in a way, you see you're contributing to that calling, that human water connection.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And let's not, there's issues. You can have too much water, right? I'm also a believer in moderation, right? 2 drinks isn't bad, but you don't want to have 8 drinks and fall off the boat.
Nope.
You know what I'm saying? So I'm a believer in moderation. And so, you know, we're talking about, we had the hurricane, obviously, just blow through here. And, you know, we weren't devastated by flooding, but flooding absolutely occurred. And we have had some devastating floods that have hit our state. And so on the flip side, we had to be very mindful that too much of a good thing is a problem, and too much water causing major floods. And of course, that's been an issue in Copenhagen. It's been an issue all southern France. I mean, it's been an issue in Germany, all over Europe. England, I mean, UK, you've dealt with major pluvial as well as fluvial floods. And we have as well in our state and a lot of other southern states. The storm that just hit, I was talking to Dr. Evan Bean at the University of Florida, one of my alumni, and I was asking him, how much rain did you get? And he's like, we got 25 centimeters at one of my Monterey locations.
Oh, wow.
That's a lot of rain.
In a short amount of time.
Yeah, in about a day and a half or 2 days. Yeah. And so we can't say, I love water, but obviously in the same pool, we have to do something. And so one of the other things I want to share, an effort that we are engaged in a lot right now, and I'm going to go into the history again of America a little bit. Hopefully you guys are hopefully you're not sick of this, the listeners, but the United States, the South, the southern part of the United States, it's not only us, but it's certainly a part of our heritage. It's an unfortunate part. We developed as a sort of a two-class society. We had free people and we had enslaved people. And the enslaved people were from Africa. And the free people were of European heritage, in the South specifically. And with the conclusion of the Civil War, the enslaved people were set free by at the conclusion of the Civil War. 600,000 Americans died, to end slavery. And Abraham Lincoln made sure that was the outcome. But that doesn't mean that the people who were once enslaved and now free had a smooth ride from there, right? And as such, historically, there has been segregation, as it is the right word. Even if not by law, there has been segregation of communities, right? And so the people that had wealth would live in the higher parts of town where it was less apt to flood, And then the people that did not have the wealth were forced to live in places that were often, not always, but often more flood prone. Wherever they were living was less desirable than where the more prosperous citizenry lived, right? Well, what that means now in cities, certainly across the South, and North Carolina is a southern state, but it's not just in the South, it is other places as well, is that when you have floods, there's a disproportionately likely chance that flood is impacting disadvantaged or marginalized communities, or what we would refer to as in the United States. There's lots of different, but often people of color, but generally people who are less financially advantaged.
Or at a topographical disadvantage, you could say.
They are topographically disadvantaged,
coming from a city planning perspective when I think about it as well sometimes.
That's a great, and I'm glad you said that. I'm going to start using that because they are topographically disadvantaged. And so one of the things that we have been doing in the last 5-6 years, we've had a couple of projects in advance of that, but it's been an effort the last 5 or 6 years, is to try to work with the communities that have long had less infrastructure available to them. Okay. And trying to help them, those communities, and the people that live in those communities be less subject to floods or reduce the risk of floods for them.
Building resilience.
And that has been a really, again, I talk about the things that I can do during the day. So like when I put my head down at night, Peter, I sleep well. This is one of the things where I sleep well. I'm like knowing that we're engaged in that. And in fact, one of my colleagues that's working with me right now just won an almost $1 million grant to help 2 neighborhoods in a community in North Carolina that are historically disadvantaged, that are certainly topographically disadvantaged, reduce their flooding.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's awesome. And that's a calling for people in our field. And I know it may not sound on some level as fancy as getting rid of pathogens or as cool as investigating microplastic trapping efficiencies, but it makes a real impact on a lot of people. And there's a lot of nobleness associated with that. And I certainly would encourage people who are in our position to look for those opportunities. And you know what? I may not get a journal article out of that. It does not matter.
It does not matter.
It does not matter.
It's not everything.
I will also know that there'll be scores of people that will benefit from being able to get in their car and drive in the street if they need to go to the hospital during times of floods.
And I'm really excited to see where that project's going to head in the coming years, because it seems like that's really now where your passion lies, in a way, solving a lot of the technical aspects of the green infrastructure. But now let's bring in the people a lot more. They say quantity, quality, amenity, biodiversity, the common 4 words used for green infrastructure nowadays. But I think for you, really going into how we can make things more just, more equal, more beneficial to everyone.
Right. People deserve basic levels of service, right? And to not be flooded on the regular probably counts as one of those things, right? And it's not, look, there's a lot of other great things to do. And I just want to make sure that everyone gets to have a part of the benefit. Everyone benefits from what we do. And I want everybody to benefit. And that, I don't care what you look like. Everybody.
Definitely.
I want everybody to benefit, right? To be able to take advantage of a really neat wetland that's been turned into a park that has education and walking paths, and to be inspired. We might not be inspiring engineers, but we might be inspiring biologists or ecologists. Like, we as people in the GSI field have so much we get to bring to the table to help people. It's awesome.
Definitely. And looking forward to seeing what comes in the next few years. Bill, this has been an amazing conversation so far, covering every different aspects around the many passions you have around stormwater, also Roman infrastructure, history and engineering coming together, and really designing for the people. But like I do with every guest, I'd love to ask you the key questions that I ask everyone on the show.
Yes.
And in a way, with all those different projects, all the different inspirations you have, what is that one inspiration that you can sort of say drives you? Is it that water people connection? Is it something else?
I would say it's my love of people. Okay. I am a spiritual person, Peter. I'm not afraid to share that with folks. And I believe that we are on this earth. We've been put here for a purpose. We've been put here for a purpose. And that I believe every soul on this earth is important. And when that belief is internalized, then you will do things to help society just because you believe that's what you're called to do. Now, it just so happens that my passion is in the realm of water. And so I chosen to try to help people in the realm of water. But the basis of it is that I believe everybody on this planet, there's no accident. Everyone's on this planet for a reason. And for those of us that are in a position of influence or that can make decisions, then it's really our responsibility to give to the people. Okay. That is what motivates me more than anything.
And I think once you find that purpose, that calling that we've also mentioned so many times in this episode so far, I think you start to see things fall into place, and you start to see, I guess, the journey ahead, which is never a straight line. And John certainly, I think, learned a lot from you as well in that regard. But I guess an adventure ahead.
Yeah, I'm so proud of John. That's all I can. When you said his name, I really thought about him and a few of his classmates, how fabulous they are and what great work they're doing now. John at Tennessee and Ryan Whitson, Ohio State, and Tricia Culberson, who was also worked with John at Kansas State, Evan Bean, who was a colleague of John's at the University of Florida. And there's a Matthew Jones. The list can keep going on, but it's not just universities, Peter. It's people that are in industry. Dr. Matthew Jones works for Hazen and Sawyer, and he has helped New York City with all of its green stormwater infrastructure. It's just like, what are the great joys as I look back upon my career? One of my proudest of, honestly, it's them.
Yeah.
It's them. It's what they've done.
Yeah.
And how they touch people.
And we've had John on the show, and I'm sure with your help, we can try and get the others on the show as well to share their stories as well.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll enjoy it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Was there a key moment, book, person, or I guess event that completely changed the course of your career or mindset? You mentioned the story of the waterfall, but... Yeah,
boy, that would be one. I think taking that hydrology class in 1993 that I told you about when I was doing the spreadsheet and delayed a date for an hour. Yeah, and I took it on the chin for that too, but it's a great story. It's a true story. It's a great story to this day. I would say that it being in that class and having Dr. Malcolm, in fact, this is a full circle thing. So that was 1993. I had this class and was really inspired by Dr. Malcolm and his care for people as well, right? And my mom and dad, my dad, he instilled a love of people and that everybody has a chance and give people a chance. So I've had that. So it's like one moment, but I would say that taking that class in hydrology, urban hydrology in 1993 was the thing that put my career, it wasn't immediate, but within a few years, that's where I was, right? And so I'd say that was it. And then we talk about honors. So Dr. Malcolm passed away, I think, in 2006, 2007. And about a decade after that, the Water Association of North Carolina established the H. Rooney Malcolm Stormwater Professional of the Engineer Award. And almost 30 years after I took Dr. Malcolm's class, I was presented that award. I was nominated.
Oh, wow.
I didn't even know it. I was nominated by a colleague, Hunter Freeman, and I won that award almost 30 years after I think it was 28 years after I'd had his class. And I think about sort of a bookend moment. Obviously, I'm still working. I'm not done.
Yeah, but still.
But receiving that, and that was just about the same year as the book, right? Those two things kind of aligned. And I felt that, an important, I felt fulfillment, Peter.
So
and
beautiful.
I felt peace. Mm-hmm.
That's so beautiful. And in a way, it also coming all the way back to the childhood days. By taking that class, you saw how all of a sudden what you had been experimenting with could be then put into practice.
Like I could make money doing that.
The nuts and bolts behind it, definitely.
Yeah, like I could get paid for this. It's not just a class, but there's careers in this. Oh my God, sign me up.
Yeah.
Right. And that's really, that's what's happened.
I guess the key moments, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about, anything you want in the world, whether it's your situation, the world itself, overnight, what would that be?
Yeah, I looked at this question this morning when I was taking a walk on the Greenway, and I put, and I am going to leave the realm that we're speaking of, though it does relate tangentially.
Mm-hmm.
I would ask people to put their social media aside. I would ask for them to do that, not give it up, but let's just de-emphasize it.
Mm-hmm.
I would ask for people to see each other as people and to enter the forum, a real forum of conversation. Now, I don't know if Europe is like this, okay? I do think it is, but I don't live there. But the United States has become a little too tribal, all right?
Okay.
That you got people on one side of the political spectrum, and because of social media, they can live in an echo chamber.
Yeah.
And they can just keep hearing the same things again and again. And then people on the other side of the spectrum, they're the same way. They just hear the same things again and again. And it's like we've lost the common language. I happen to be a centrist. Not that that matters. I could be a conservative or a liberal. It wouldn't matter, all right? I consider myself to be sort of a centrist who believes that both sides have good things to share, all right? But what's happened is that too often, and way more than when I was a kid, I suspect when you were a kid, that to hold a divergent political opinion or a social opinion from someone, it used to just mean, Peter, that you had a different opinion.
Yeah.
Now, for too many people, it means you're a bad person, or it means you're a flawed person. And if not bad, but flawed, well, there's something not quite right with him or her, right? And to me, I view that as the gravest threat to our times is an inability of people to hold different opinions and to speak to each other without fear of shaming or just the vitriol that has entered into the public discourse. And so if I could wave my magic wand, I would have people be freer and less inhibited and more accepting of public discourse, which I suspect would happen if we didn't rely on social media as much as we do.
I could certainly see a point. I see this polarization in all sorts of things, whether it's politics or, just even normal day-to-day opinions. And I can see social media has, in a way, contributed to that in more ways than we can imagine. But even just putting your phone aside and having a face-to-face conversation from time to time, I think we could use a bit of that. So,
Peter, think about how hard it is to insult somebody when you're looking at them in the eyes versus insulting them when you don't even know who they are.
Very true.
And so I appreciate what you just shared. So that would be my magic wand, Peter.
Very nice use of it. Let's hope that we don't need it. Let's hope the world progresses in that direction. But
yeah, I agree. That's right.
I guess we'll see. What was one of the most challenging situations that you've ever faced in your career to date? And how did you overcome it?
Yeah. I'm going to get a little personal on you here. Remember I talked about humility?
Yep.
Okay. So, at the height of my career, we were just killing it, Peter. Like 15 to 20 publications a year.
Oh, wow.
I mean, just killing it, right? And I was pretty confident lad. And I invested a lot of time in my career at the expense of my family. and I was married to a very kind woman. And she said, we're friends. We're friends to this day. But I, sort of let that confidence, perhaps arrogance, get the best of me. And I didn't dedicate the time that I should have to the people that actually really loved me, right? And my wife and my kids. And so I'd say that was the biggest disaster, personal disaster, right, of my life. But once you have gone through that and you've been beaten by it, because it's tough, it's hard, it drives you to your knees. You're like, my God. And it's important to be reflective. And it wasn't like it's just, it takes two, but you think about your role in how that happened and you rebound, you hit the bottom, and then you get up, right? And it's in that getting up and saying, okay, I'm going to do things differently.
Yep.
And you know what, Peter? I'm a better dad now than I was then. I've always loved my children, but I'm telling you, I am a better dad now. And the time I spend with them, I cherish. And I've been able, and I can see it as they've gotten older, because the story I told you is, that we're getting pushing it's almost a decade now since this happened, right? Not quite, but we're getting closer to that. And the rebound from hitting that rock bottom and then having a better understanding of who I am and what I need to do, recognizing the mistakes that were made and sort of this pursuit to be the best, almost a ruthless pursuit. Not that I would be, backstab. I wasn't into that, but this idea, this just intense focus on being the best I could and forgetting really who loves you, right? My students love me and I love my students and I love my colleagues. But none of us love each other like I love my children and they love me, like my parents and my sister love me, right? And I love them. And so I'd say that was the biggest challenge. And it was simply just overcome by great reflection and honestly, humility. I had to say, what in the world did I do? What did I just do? But there was the bounce back. I didn't wallow in it. And I've come back. And Peter, I really am as happy in my life now as I really have ever been. And I feel as blessed with my life now as I ever have been. And, when you go through a failed relationship, I feel like that's even going to help me as my kids get older. Like I'm going to be able to counsel them in ways that maybe I wouldn't have. So the idea of taking the negative and finding the positive in it is sort of central to my being.
Yeah.
So there it is. That's the hardest thing I've ever had to do and how it's bounced back. But it's bounced back through support. I told you I'm a spiritual person. That helped make me a pretty spiritual person.
Yeah.
To bounce back like that. And I just feel very lucky now. And I feel very lucky to have had that job as an extension specialist the whole time because it's allowed me to interact with people. And, I didn't sink down into like a total depression because I had stuff I had to do. Right. So I just have felt very lucky. I'm a very lucky guy. Very, very lucky guy, Peter.
But that's really an experience close to your heart. And it's, thanks for being very open and sharing that, because I think that shows people that even, the brightest, most prolific, most productive people, they also face challenges in their life. And I think the lessons you've learned from it and what you've just told us, the whole story, it sort of shows you don't have to be obsessed with trying to be as productive as possible. You still achieve great things while making sure you pay close attention to the people who love you the most and keep your family close.
You got it, Peter.
No, definitely.
I'm thrilled you did that. You encapsulated that beautifully.
And I've certainly gone through some hardships, but as you said, there's a silver lining to everything. And the key is to take what you've learned from it and to help others that may go through the same kind of path or the same journey.
That's
few
right.
years down the track.
You never know. There's a word in Spanish called the Camino, which is the journey, the path of the famous Camino de Santiago pilgrimage path in Spain. And I think about, and I've done some work in Spain, as you know, with Luis Sanudo.
Who has been on the show. Yep.
Yeah. And I think about that. My life now is once you've been working for a while, man, I'm 27 plus years in, and you recognize that you've been on a Camino and there's been highs and there's been lows. But in general, the road has got like the stock market, it's gone up, it's gotten better.
Yep.
It's gotten better. There's been dips, but it's gotten better. But the Camino, just walking that Camino or living that Camino, as you can reflect on it, can give you great satisfaction, right? It's like, you're living your life, a well-lived life. You're walking that path, even if not everything goes right, all right? that applies to, think about people who write grants and don't get the grant the first time.
That's true.
Right? It's the same type of thing. I remember you talking about that with Anna about, getting your first rejection and then overcoming it in a journal article and then submitting it again, right? Think about how much more that second submission meant to you when it got accepted, right?
An even bigger accomplishment.
Yeah, there's great accomplishment than just walking the path. Look, I'm going to tell you something from one of these workshops. There's a guy that I talked with in Charlotte, North Carolina, our largest city. And he's like, Bill, he lives in Charlotte, East Coast, Southeast United States. He says, my goal is I want to drive my car to Alaska. Now, look, that's a long way. That's a long way, right? I want to drive my car to Alaska. I would guess it's about 8,000 kilometers. Look, I don't know for sure, but that seems about right.
Yeah, pretty much.
And he says, Bill, do you know what the most important step in driving your car to Alaska? I don't remember what my answer was, but it was something like, I was very pragmatic about making sure your car is in good order. And he goes, no, starting.
Yep.
Starting. And I think that is something else for people to think about. Maybe I just try it.
Yeah.
I tell my kids, I said, the answer is no if you don't ask. Right?
Yep.
Ask.
What's the worst that can happen?
They may say yes.
Yep.
Right. If there's something you're interested in, start.
Yep.
Start. The most important thing to do when you drive to Alaska is start.
Drive to Alaska or start a new topic, go to a waterfall, anything. Start.
Start. You got to start.
Yep.
You can't finish it. Another thing I tell my kids is you can't win it if you're not in it.
Yep. A lot of different
sayings. You can't win it if you're not in it.
Yep.
Yeah. I think I told John Hathaway that as well.
Yeah.
Not just biological kids, like all of my students. If you can't win it if you're not in it.
No, that is true.
So throw your hat in. Let's see what happens.
Start on the Camino, because everyone has a Camino. I do like that word, actually.
Start on the Camino.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I love the Camino. We are all on a Camino. And you don't always recognize it until you've been walking on it for a while.
That is true. That is true.
Right. But let me tell you, when you get 27 plus years in and basically one job, you recognize it. You see all the people that have helped you.
Yeah.
There's rivers you had to ford. Well, who helped you ford those rivers? You didn't do it by yourself.
Usually people come in.
Yeah. You have Anna. You have a bunch of people that have been your mentors,
Definitely.
right?
And it's been great to have them. Still trying to get all of them on the podcast, but I've had a few on there so far. So yeah, looking forward to completing that list and adding more people in future as well, because many have taught me a lot of valuable lessons. So let's see what's in store for me as well. But I guess in terms of going on the Camino, there's many things you often have to do as part of, everyday life, whether it's work or whether it's family. But what tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? How do you balance between your professional and personal time?
I used to be really bad at it, right? And I think some people who are still waiting for me to respond to emails would still say I'm really bad at it, right? But I think in general, in terms of balancing the work and the personal life, is just dedicate time, block time out. So I went on a vacation with my sweetheart down to the Florida Keys over America's holiday, the 4th of July or Independence Day. Thank you, Great Britain. That was the day we left you guys. But I went down and I'm like, you know what? I'm leaving. I said, I'm leaving my computer. This is for you and me, honey.
Yep.
Right. And we're going to be together. And I took my kids to central part of the United States a couple weeks ago and I left my computer. Okay. Now, when I got back, guess what I did? I opened up that computer and I worked really hard.
Yep.
Okay. It's not like, okay, I'm just going to work 6 hours a day. No. I busted my rear end.
Okay.
All right. But when I am with my family and my loved ones, I focus on them. And when I'm at work, I focus on work. And I try to be pretty strict adherent. So the weekends that I have my kids, I try to do any work.
Yep.
On weekends where my children are with their mom, I'll definitely do some work. But I also want to spend time with other people that I like and love too, right? I have good friends and I kind of have a woman that I love. So, I try to spend time. But when I'm with my kids, I'm giving the kids my time. And I think just being very intentional about that is the best way to sort of maximize, or using engineering term, optimize our life balance, right?
Yeah.
But I tend to be all in one or the other when I'm doing it.
But I guess it's non-negotiable, black and white. You must set those boundaries and be intentional.
You have to set those boundaries. That is correct. Yeah.
And in a way, in a busy lifestyle like this, you just have to you have to do it because I guess you need that mind to switch off at times and you need to enjoy
You have to take a break. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the other thing you can do, and there are opportunities where you can merge it together. You know, like you said, I taught classes in Spain and Italy, and I'll bring a kid or two with me.
Yeah.
And so you can get the best of both worlds sometimes too. And, they're learning about Roman infrastructure while we're there. So it's not as if I have to keep them completely separate. I do look for opportunities where I can have the things that I love in my life that might seem like in disparate places actually coincide and be together for, multiple days, a week or whatever, when the opportunity arises.
Yeah. I guess the opportunities will show themselves and then, leverage it when you can.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's true. And so what other advice can you offer to young engineers, young scientists starting out?
Well, this may be repeat, but it is my advice I give all early students. Find your passion. Don't be afraid of it, because when you find your passion, work is not laborious. That's my advice. And as we said early on, it's that keys to your passion may well be found, several decades ago in your life. That may be where they're lurking. So that's my big advice. And then I have a thing I told John and others, make your job work for you. All right. And I've had the opportunity to do that, being invited, let's say, to go down to Atlanta, for example, to give a lecture. And they give me, when do you want to come? But what I'll do is I'll look when a sporting event that I'm interested in is being played. I'm like, I'll come down. Can I come down on that Thursday? Because there's a NC State football team playing that night at Georgia Tech. And so I do it. So I'm doing my job, but when it's over in the evening, I can do something I really love, right? So make your jobs, that's the other thing, make your job work for you when the opportunity allows. So there's a couple of bits of advice for our younger listeners. Oh, and love people. Do the best you can. Remember, the people are sitting there waiting. They're even dependent on you, right? Remember, you're doing this to help people out, and you'll get great fulfillment.
And I think all the different experiences you've reflected on, all the different topics we've covered, I think pretty much hone those key pieces of advice home, I think, to our listeners. So where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
Well, I work at NC State University, and you can Google Bill Hunt, NC State, all right? Now, I just alluded to, I'm not the easiest person to reach, but if you put something good in your subject line, like heard you on Peter's or Grand Challenges, do that. That will get my attention. I promise you. And also, as you search that, particularly for folks in America, we have workshops we offer, some of which are webinars that anyone in the world certainly can take part in. And we have had certainly international people participate in that, both on stormwater design as well as Romans. I do a lot on Roman infrastructure. And so there are multiple types of webinars that if you're not anywhere near North Carolina, that you can participate in as well. But for those of you who have listened to this and actually found something I've said to be inspirational or at least curious, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you.
And we'll definitely put any leads to contact you, to get in touch with you in the show notes, along with a lot of other things we've covered today, Bill.
Thank you.
But thanks a lot for being on the show. It's been fantastic having you and just going through your stories, your Camino, and having a bit of a laugh here and there, but also a good moment of reflection as well.
Thank you.
Like I do with every guest on the show, I always give my guest the last words. So I guess one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
To love what you do. Find your calling and love what you do. Because if you work in your calling, a job is not laborious. There you go. And have fun while you're at it. And we did talk a little bit, I mentioned a little bit earlier that I wrote a song. I actually write songs. They're typically parodies. For example, Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire became Lid is Higher. And I sing that at some of our conferences in the US. So like ponds, we talk about ponds and low impact development and just make joke. So I like to write songs, right? But maybe my first one was something called the Stormwater Riprap. And I'm going to make sure I share that with you so the audience can at least hear a verse or two of the Stormwater Riprap.
So take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Yo, Dazzle, you ready to go, girl?
Only if McNasty in the house.
I'm ready, DJ Storm.
I was driving down the interstate and it was raining. I was thinking, this is great. Saw some runoff flowing from the street. Said that's something we gotta treat. nuisance, flooding, groundwater recharge. The problems we face, man, they're large. Nutrient, sediment, oil, and grit. And don't forget the pathogens that come from
Oh yeah.
Won't you please build me stormwater BMPs?
Hey, hey.
Won't you please build me stormwater BMPs? We got stormwater, wetlands, and pavement that perk. My studies show bioretention works. Cisterns, level spreaders, filter stripping. We study green roofs, ain't that tripping?
Oh yeah.
Won't you please build me stormwater BMPs?
Hey, hey.
Won't you please build me stormwater BMPs? We design, construct, monitor, maintain. We're always happy when it rains, oh yeah. Won't you please build me stormwater BMPs?
Hey, hey.
Won't you please build me stormwater BMPs?
Wolfpack.
Won't you please build me stormwater BMPs?
And that wraps up our incredible, heartwarming and inspiring episode with Bill Hunt. For tips and strategies on stormwater green infrastructure, wisdom on finding your Camino, or just an appreciation of our connection to water, check out the show notes for more information over at petermbach.com/podcast. And as always, thank you listeners for tuning in to this episode and for your feedback and support. If you are enjoying this show, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this podcast with your family, friends, colleagues, and all our fellow humans. Please also do subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you are listening from to be notified of the latest release as soon as it becomes available. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on X at petermbach or Instagram at petermbach87. Feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or guest suggestions so that I can keep improving this show. The podcast intro and outro song is called Starsky by Alex Kieran. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.